She pulled the ring off her own finger and set it on the table in front of the most powerful man in Virginia, in front of his guests. His candlelight, his carefully arranged worlds, and said, "I was not put on this earth to be someone's convenient arrangement." The room stopped breathing. Nathaniel Brooks stared at her like she had spoken in a language he had never been taught. She picked up her shawl, she walked out, and every single person at that table knew, even if they could not say it yet, that something irreversible had just happened. If a woman's dignity means something to you, subscribe. Follow this story to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Amelia's story travels. The invitation had not been a question. Amelia Carter understood that the moment she held it, thick paper, heavy ink, Nathaniel Brooks's signature at the bottom like a seal pressed into wax. Not "would you join us?" Not "I hope you might attend." Just a date and a time and an address, and the assumption, built into every line of it, that she would come, because of course she would come. Women in her position always came when Nathaniel Brooks called. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it on the writing desk her father had built for her mother 30 years ago, the desk that wobbled on its left leg and still smelled of cedar when the mornings were damp, and she sat for a while with her hands in her lap and thought about what it meant to be expected. She had been expected her whole life, expected to be grateful, expected to be quiet, expected to make herself useful in whatever form the moment required, expected to take up exactly as much space as she was given and be thankful it was that much. She had done all of it. She had done it well, and tonight, she told herself, tonight would be different. Tonight Nathaniel Brooks would look at her, truly look at her, and whatever careful transaction had brought them to this point would become something else. Something real. She believed that. She needed to believe it. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. Her mother came to the doorway of her bedroom while she was dressing and stood there with the particular expression of a woman who has something important to say and is measuring the cost of saying it. "You look beautiful," Margaret Carter said. "Mama." Amelia turned from the mirror. "Tell me the truth." Her mother stepped inside and closed the door. Margaret Carter was a woman who had carried quiet dignity through hard years the way other women carried pearls, not for show, but because it had become part of her. She crossed the room and took Amelia's hands and held them. "The truth," she said carefully, "is that tonight matters more than just the two of you. I know about the land. Then you know why this has to go well. I know why everyone needs it to go well," Amelia said. "That's not the same thing." Her mother's grip tightened slightly. "Amelia, has he ever once asked what I think about something?" She kept her voice even. "In 6 weeks of this arrangement, has he asked me a single question that wasn't about the family accounts or the property lines?" Her mother was quiet. "That's what I thought. He's a serious man," her mother said. "Serious men take time," Amelia said. "Are still men. They can choose to see something if they decide it's worth seeing." She looked at her mother directly. "I'm going tonight with my eyes open, Mama. I just need you to be honest with me about what I'm walking into." Margaret Carter looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said softly, "Walk in with your head up. Whatever happens, keep your head up." It wasn't a reassurance. It was a warning dressed up as one. Amelia recognized the difference. She kissed her mother's cheek, picked up her shawl, and went downstairs. Thomas Reed was waiting by the carriage. He had been with the Carter family since before Amelia was born, a man built from loyalty and economy of words. The kind of man who communicated everything important through the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes. He looked at her when she came through the door, not at the gown or the effort she'd made. At her. All of her. "I reckon so." Thomas. He helped her up without another word, and somehow that was exactly right. Brooks Estate announced itself a quarter-mile before the house was visible. Carriages lined the drive 3 deep. Light blazed from every window. The sound of voices drifted out into the warm evening air with the easy confidence of people who had never once wondered whether they were welcome somewhere. Amelia stepped out and stood for a moment at the bottom of the front steps, listening. She had been in rooms like this before. She knew how to hold her chin level, keep her breathing steady, smile at people who were looking through her rather than at her. She knew how to be present in a room without taking up space. She had spent years perfecting that particular skill. She walked up the steps. Inside the entry hall was all beeswax candles and expensive perfume, and the murmur of Virginia's finest families arranging themselves according to wealth and connection. She heard her name pass between people the way a piece of information gets passed, not warmly, but usefully. Yes, that's her, the Carter girl. The one Brooks chose, not the one he loves, not the one he wants. The one he chose, like a parcel of land or a well-situated investment. She moved into the room. Nathaniel found her before she found him. He appeared at her side with the brisk purposefulness of a man completing a task on a list. Tall and broad-shouldered, and dressed in the kind of clothes that announced wealth without mentioning it. He was handsome. Amelia had always been able to acknowledge that the way you acknowledged a river was clear without wanting to drink from it. "Miss Carter," he offered his arm. "You're on time. Not you look lovely." "I'm glad you're here. You're on time." As though punctuality were the primary virtue he required of her. She took his arm. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks." He moved her through the room at the pace of a man with somewhere more important to be. He made introductions the way he signed documents efficiently. Without warmth, name and title exchanged in the air, and then they were moving again before the conversation could become anything real. Governor Slade, Miss Carter. Mr. and Mrs. Hensley. Miss Carter. Congressman Ward, Miss Carter. Each time she smiled and said the right words, and each time Nathaniel moved them forward before she could be anything more than a name attached to his arm. She noticed he never looked at her while they walked. His eyes worked the room the way a general's eyes work a battlefield, tracking, assessing, managing. She was on his arm the way a sword was at a general's hip. Present, necessary, not consulted. Across the room she caught Clara Monroe watching her. Clara was her oldest friend, sharp and honest in ways that occasionally cost her, socially and loyal in ways that made up for every bit of it. Their eyes met and Clara's face said, "Are you all right?" Amelia's face said, "I'm fine." Clara's face said, "You are not fine and we both know it, so don't you dare look away from me." Amelia looked away. Dinner was served with the unhurried elegance of everything at Brooks Estate. 40 people. Long table. More candlelight. The measured conversation of men discussing land prices and railroad routes and the particular stubbornness of county commissioners, while their wives discussed the harvest and the heat, and whose daughter was marrying whom, and whether the match was suitable. Suitable. That word was already in the air before Nathaniel said it. He spoke to everyone at the table except her, in 40 minutes of the first 2 courses. Their entire exchange consisted of him asking whether she preferred the fish or the fowl, and then nodding at a servant when she said the fowl. That was the sum of his interest in her that evening. 1 question, 1 nod. Done. She sat and kept her face arranged into the expression she had been practicing since she was old enough to understand that a woman's face in a room like this was something she was expected to manage carefully, like a fire that needed to look warm without burning anything down. She was midway through the 2nd course when Nathaniel tapped his glass. The table went quiet, immediately, completely, the way rooms go quiet for men who have never had to ask twice. He rose. "I want to thank everyone for coming this evening." His voice carried easily, the voice of a man who had never once stood in a room and wondered if anyone would listen. "I know how valuable your time is. I'm grateful for your presence on an occasion of personal significance." He paused. The room leaned slightly forward. "I want to take this opportunity to address something directly. There has been considerable speculation about my intentions regarding Miss Carter and the Carter family." Another pause. Deliberate, measured, I believe in plain language. He glanced down at her, not at her face, at her general vicinity, the way you glance at a contract you're referencing. "This marriage exists because it benefits both families. That is its foundation and its purpose. Nothing more. Nothing less. He straightened. Miss Carter is a suitable match. Sensible, respectable. She comes from good family. She will make an acceptable wife. The last word dropped into the room and stayed there. Acceptable. Not remarkable, not extraordinary. Not the woman I have chosen to build my life beside. Acceptable. Like a piece of furniture that would serve its function without causing problems. Amelia heard it, the way you hear something you have been half expecting, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation. She heard every person at the table receive it. She watched a woman lift her fan. She saw a man press his lips together. She saw her father, at the far end of the table, look down at his plate with the slow and deliberate attention of a man trying to disappear into his own silverware. She felt something happen inside her chest, not heartbreak. She had steeled herself for something jagged and breathless. And what arrived was quieter than that. It was the very specific feeling of watching the last small hope you'd been carrying finally put itself down. Set itself down, look at you once, and stop. He had proven them all exactly right. She was a solution, a function, a convenient answer wrapped in blue silk. She reached for her water glass. Her hand was steady. She noticed that with a kind of distant gratitude the steadiness of her own hand, and she took one and set the glass down and sat for exactly 3 more seconds with the full weight of the room pressing down on her shoulders. Then she stood, the whispers cut off. 40 people turned. Nathaniel looked up with the mild surprise of a man who hadn't expected the furniture to move. Amelia reached down to her left hand. She found the ring, the one he had placed there 6 weeks ago in his study on a Tuesday afternoon, with all the romantic ceremony of a man countersigning a deed, and she pulled it from her finger. She felt it slide free. She felt the bare lightness of that finger without it. And she thought, yes, that is exactly what this feels like. She set the ring beside his plate. Not slam. Sat down, carefully, with the same precise control he had used every time he'd treated her like a transaction. The room had gone so quiet she could hear the candles burning. "Mr. Brooks," she said. Her voice came out even. She hadn't planned it. It simply arrived that way, from somewhere deep and certain she hadn't known existed until this exact moment. "I owe you honesty. You've been honest with me tonight. So I'll return it." He was watching her now with the full, focused attention he had withheld from her all evening. She had his complete attention. The bitter irony of that was not lost on her. "I have spent a long time making myself smaller for rooms that were never going to make space for me," she said. "I have been sensible and respectable and suitable. And I told myself that was enough, that if I was just enough of all those careful, manageable things, someone would eventually look past the list and find the person." She paused. No one breathed. "Tonight you showed me something. Mr. Brooks, you showed me that suitable was always the ceiling. That I was always going to be exactly as useful as you required and not one thing more." She held his gaze. His face had gone very still, but she could see something working behind his eyes. She kept going. "I don't blame you for it. A man can only see as far as his imagination reaches." A small sound somewhere down the table. She didn't look. "But I will not marry a man who has already decided my worth," she said. "I will not build a life on someone else's convenience. And I will not sit at this table one more minute and pretend that acceptable is something a woman like me should be grateful for." She lifted her shawl from the back of her chair. She settled it around her shoulders with the unhurried steadiness of a woman who has all the time in the world. "I wish you well, Mr. Brooks." She meant it. That was the strangest part, she meant it completely. "Good evening." And she walked, the full length of the dining room. 40 people, every eye on her. She did not hurry. She did not stumble. She did not look back once. Through the entry hall. Out the door a servant scrambled to open, down the steps. Into the warm night air. She kept walking, and the sound of the house fell away behind her. And the night closed around her, and she breathed. Thomas Reed read her face the way a man who has known someone since childhood reads it, not the surface but the whole truth underneath. He said nothing. He moved to the carriage door and opened it and held out his hand. She took it. She got in. The door closed. They were moving before she heard the front door of Brooks' estate open behind them. She did not turn around. She sat in the dark with her bare left hand folded in her lap, and she breathed in and out. Steady and slow, and somewhere in the tree line a night bird was calling the same two notes over and over. Patient as a heartbeat. She listened to it and she did not cry. Not because she was refusing to, because what she felt was not grief. It was something colder and cleaner and more useful than grief. She was angry, not the hot, unraveling kind of angry that makes you say things you regret at 3 in the morning. The other kind, the still, clear-eyed kind that settles into your bones and becomes something you can actually use. She thought about the word acceptable and the room that had received it, and the women behind their fans, and the men who hadn't bothered to hide their amusement, and her father's eyes on his silverware. She thought never again. She thought it once quietly and completely. And then she put it somewhere permanent and stopped thinking about him. The house was dark except for one lamp in the sitting room. Her mother was in the chair by the window, hands folded, face arranged into the expression of a woman who has been sitting with a terrible thing and has not yet decided whether she is going to survive it. She looked up. Her eyes went directly to Amelia's left hand. The bare finger. Her voice was barely sound. "I know, Mama. I know your father will, Mama." Amelia sat down across from her and took her hands. "Listen to me. Right now I need you to listen." Her mother went still. "I need to know the real truth about where we stand," Amelia said. "Not the version everyone decided I couldn't handle. The actual truth. All of it tonight." Silence stretched between them. Then Margaret Carter looked at her daughter, truly looked at her. The way she hadn't in years, and something in her face shifted. Like a door deciding to open, she told her everything. The debts accumulated over 12 years. The contracts her father had signed without reading through. The loans taken against the western parcel. The conversations she'd overheard between Amelia's father and his brother about selling. Surrendering, walking away with whatever dignity they could carry. She told her all of it. When she finished, the lamp had burned low. Amelia sat with it, let it settle, turned it over in her mind the way you turn over ground you're deciding whether to plant. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Her mother looked at her with love and guilt threaded together in a way that was almost impossible to separate. "Because you were the solution, sweetheart, not the one who needed to solve it." Amelia absorbed that. She understood the logic. She understood that the people who loved her had arranged the world so she would arrive at that engagement already settled, already committed, already past the point of needing to know the full truth. She understood it completely. She did not accept it. "I need the financial record," she said, "every document we have. Every contract, every deed, every account ledger. Tonight if they're accessible. Tomorrow morning first thing if they're not." Her mother stared. "What are you going to do with them?" "I'm going to read them." She stood. "And then I'm going to figure out what we actually have and what we actually owe, and whether the story everyone and is as inevitable as they think, Amelia. We are not losing this land." "Mama." Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge in it that hadn't been there this morning. "Not to debt, not to bad decisions made by people who never thought to ask for a second opinion. And not to whoever comes next, thinking the Carter family is a problem he can solve for his own benefit." Her mother looked up at her. And something shifted in her expression, something that had been braced and afraid and quietly desperate became something else. Something that looked like the beginning of belief. "Where did you come from?" she said softly. Amelia picked up the lamp. "I've been here the whole time," she said. "Everybody just kept talking over me." She did not sleep. She sat at her mother's writing desk until well past midnight, with the account book spread open in front of her, a fresh candle burning down beside the old one, and she read. She read everything. 12 years of financial records. Poorly organized and worse maintained. full of the small surrenders and careless decisions of men who had never been told no by a world that should have told them no far sooner. She read it the way you read something you need to understand completely before you can begin to fight it. The picture that emerged was bad. But it was not, and this was the thing that kept her at the desk when any reasonable person would have gone to bed. It was not inevitable. The debts were real. The missed payments were real. The contracts that had quietly taken more than they should have were real. But the land was also real. The western parcel her father had put up as collateral was real, and from what she could see in the oldest records, the records from before her father's time, that land was worth considerably more than anyone in this family had recently been treating it as worth. She didn't know why yet, but she was going to find out. She pressed her fingertips to her eyes, breathed, and kept reading. 3 days later, Charles Whitaker came to call. He arrived in a fine carriage with 2 outriders, which was 2 more than necessary for a visit to a struggling farmhouse, and which Amelia understood immediately as a choice rather than an accident. He wanted to be seen arriving. He wanted the weight of his resources to walk through the door before he did. She was at the writing desk with the account books when Thomas knocked. "Man named Whitaker, Miss Amelia. Says he has a business proposition." She stacked the papers carefully. "Send him to the sitting room. I'll be right there." She took 30 seconds to straighten her dress and her posture and the expression on her face. Then she went in. Charles Whitaker was about 50. Comfortable in his skin, the way men were comfortable when they had never been refused anything important. He had pleasant manners. She clocked that immediately. The pleasant manners were part of the machinery. He rose when she entered, inclined his head, waited for her to sit before he did. "Miss Carter, thank you for seeing me. Charles Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker." She did not offer her hand. She sat. "What can I do for you?" "I heard about the unfortunate events at Brooks Estate," he said, settling into his chair with the ease of a man who expected comfort wherever he went. "Difficult situation. I imagine these have been a trying few days." "I've had worse," Amelia said pleasantly. Something moved behind his eyes, brief recalibrating. He smiled. "I'll come directly to the point, since I imagine you're a woman who appreciates plain dealing. I am. I've had an interest in this property for some time," he said. "The western parcel specifically. There are resources there that haven't been developed timber. Primarily, though there may be other value below the surface that your family hasn't had occasion to explore." He spread his hands in the gesture of a generous man. "Given your current circumstances, I thought this might be a good moment to discuss a sale. Fair market value, quick transfer. It would give you the liquidity to address your most pressing concerns and let your family move forward cleanly." Amelia looked at him. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "who told you about our financial situation?" A pause. "Short but there. Travels in a county like this." "It does," she agreed. "Very specifically. Down very specific paths." She tilted her head slightly. "How long have you been interested in the western parcel?" "As I said." "Sometime, specifically." His comfortable ease shifted. "Almost impers 2 years." 2 years. She nodded slowly. "And in 2 years you never approached my father directly?" "There were some preliminary, without my father mentioning it to me." She kept her voice even and pleasant and gave him nothing. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm going to ask you one direct question. And I would appreciate an honest answer, of course. Do you believe that because I am 26 years old and a woman and recently separated from an engagement, I am in a position where I'll agree to whatever you put in front of me because I don't fully understand what I have?" The pleasant manner held, but it had gone thin over the steel underneath it. He looked at her differently now, not less pleasantly. "Just more carefully. That is a very direct question," he said. "I mentioned I appreciated plain dealing a beat." 2. "I think you may be in a difficult position," he said at last. "And I am offering a genuine path forward." "You're offering me a quick sale of land you've just described as having undeveloped resources," she said. "That's not a path forward for me, Mr. Whitaker. That's a transaction that resolves your long-standing interest at the price of a permanent disadvantage to mine." She stood. I thank you for calling. I won't be selling the Western parcel. If you have another matter to discuss, I'm happy to hear it. If this was the matter, I believe we're finished. He stood. The pleasantness was still there, but it had rearranged itself into something that would outlast this conversation. You may find, he said carefully, that your position is more precarious than you currently believe. I may, she said. But I'd rather discover that on my own terms than let you remind me of it. She walked him to the door. Thomas materialized from somewhere and opened it without being asked. Whitaker stepped out, turned, looked at her one last time with the patient, calculating attention of a man who has not been told no so many times that he doesn't know how to get around it. Good day, Miss Carter. Good day, Mr. Whitaker. The door closed. Thomas looked at her. His face was as unreadable as always. But his eyes were doing something she recognized, I reckon, he said quietly. That man ain't close to done with us. No, Amelia said. He is not. She turned back toward the sitting room. Which is why we don't have much time, Thomas. I need you to help me get to the Western parcel tomorrow morning. Early, before anyone else has reason to be out that way. Ma'am, and Thomas. She paused in the doorway. Don't mention it to my father yet. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has decided which side of something he's on. Yes, ma'am, that night across the county. Nathaniel Brooks stood at the window of his study. He had a glass of brandy he hadn't touched. He had correspondence he hadn't opened. He had the specific restlessness of a man who has spent the day attempting to return to his regular life and discovering, with irritation he couldn't entirely account for, that something was preventing him. He kept returning to the same moment. Not the ring on the table, though. That image had a way of arriving without invitation. Not the room's collective silence, or the faces of his guests, or any of the 100 details of that evening that he'd been successfully cataloging and dismissing all day. He kept returning to her face, not when she was angry. Before that, the moment just before she stood that fraction of a second where something had moved through her expression and then gone very, very still, like a woman who has just understood something completely and is deciding what to do with the understanding. He had seen a lot of faces in a lot of rooms. He had sat across from governors and congressmen, and men who controlled more land and money than most people saw in a lifetime. He was not by any measure a man easily impressed. He could not explain why that expression on that face, at that moment, had lodged itself in him like a splinter he couldn't locate well enough to remove. She had called him limited. Not in those words, she'd been too precise for that, but the meaning had been clear enough. A man can only see as far as his imagination reaches. He had built an empire in Virginia on the quality of his vision. He pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass of the window. The woman he had called suitable had walked out of his house and straight into what? Exactly. Her family was drowning. She had just removed herself from the one arrangement that would have kept them afloat. By every practical calculation he knew how to make, she had done the worst possible thing for herself tonight. And yet he thought about her face, that stillness, that clarity. He thought about how she'd walked the length of his dining room with 40 people watching her and hadn't hurried once. He set the brandy glass down on the desk. He turned away from the window. He told himself he had lost a convenient arrangement. And the loss was minor, and the matter was finished. He told himself that several times. It didn't get more convincing. The Western parcel looked different in the early morning. Amelia had been there dozens of times as a child, running the fence lines with her father on summer mornings, sitting on the old boundary stones while he talked about what the land had been and what it might become someday. She had listened the way children listen to things they don't yet understand are important. Half present, half somewhere else entirely. She was fully present now. Thomas drove the wagon out before sunrise, the 2 of them sitting in comfortable silence the way people do when they've run out of things to say that aren't the truth. The land opened up around them as the light came rolling and wide. The kind of Virginia country that looked simple until you'd walked every foot of it and understood what was underneath. "How long has the timber been left?" Amelia asked. 8-9 years, Thomas said. "Your father leased the cutting rights to a man named Fulton. Fulton worked it hard for 3 seasons, then stopped coming. Nobody asked why. Did anyone find out why?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. I asked around. After Fulton stopped, a couple of his workers said he'd found something that made him nervous. Amelia looked at him. "Nervous how?" "The kind of nervous a man gets," Thomas said carefully. "When something is worth more than he's been led to believe. And he ain't sure yet who else knows it." She turned that over. "And Whitaker has been interested in this parcel for 2 years. "Yes, ma'am." "Which means Whitaker knows what Fulton found." Thomas said nothing. Which was the same as saying yes. She looked out at the land around them. The trees were dense and old, the kind of timber that took generations to grow. And beneath her feet, beneath all of it, something that had made a man nervous enough to walk away from a profitable lease without a word of explanation. "Stop the wagon, Thomas." He stopped it. She climbed down and walked to the nearest tree line and pressed her palm flat against the bark of the oldest oak she could reach. She stood there for a moment, feeling the rough solidity of it under her hand. She thought about Whitaker's face, the patience behind the pleasantness, the certainty of a man who expected to eventually get what he'd come for because he always eventually got what he'd come for. She thought about her father's contracts, signed without reading. About 12 years of small surrenders. About a family that had been sitting on something valuable without knowing it, while the men around them quietly positioned themselves to take it. She thought about Nathaniel Brooks calling her suitable in front of 40 witnesses. She pressed her palm harder against the bark. "Thomas," she said without turning around. "I need to know everything. Who surveyed this land last? Who holds the mineral assessments? And whether there's anyone in the county with the knowledge to tell me what's actually down there." "I know a man," Thomas said. "Retired assessor named Howell. He's old and he don't talk much, but he's honest. Can you get me a meeting with him? I can try." "Don't try," Amelia said. She turned around. "Get me the meeting." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She climbed back up to the wagon. She had 3 problems: the loans coming due, Whitaker circling, and a family that had no idea what it was actually sitting on. She was going to have to move faster than all 3 of them. Her father was in the study when she got back. Edmund Carter was a man who had once been capable of great things. And the tragedy of him was that he knew it and couldn't entirely account for where the capability had gone. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made too many decisions from a position of pride rather than knowledge, and had spent the last decade quietly drowning in the consequences while telling himself and everyone around him that things were nearly sordid. He looked up when she came in. He saw her face, whatever he'd been preparing to say. He didn't say it, Papa. She sat down across from him. Not in the small chair by the wall, in the chair directly across the desk. The one guest sat in, the one that meant she was there to talk business. "I went out to the western parcel." A pause. "That land is tied up in. I know what it's tied up in. I read the contracts last night." She held his gaze. "I also know a man named Whitaker came here yesterday, wanting to buy it at what he called fair market value, which I suspect is considerably less than its actual value." Her father's expression shifted through several things quickly. Discomfort. Then, underneath both of those, something she wasn't expecting: relief. Like a man who has been carrying something alone for too long and has just been offered help he doesn't know how to ask for. "He's been after that parcel for a while," Edmund said quietly. 2 years, Thomas tells me. I didn't know about the 2 years. He rubbed his jaw. "He came to me once, maybe 18 months ago, made an offer. I turned him down. Why? Because something felt wrong about it." He looked at her. "I couldn't have told you what. I just knew a man that eager to be generous usually ain't being generous." "You were right." She leaned forward slightly. Papa, I need you to trust me with this. He was quiet. I am not a child, she said. I am not someone you need to protect from the truth of our situation. I have read every document in this house in the last 3 days, and I understand what we're facing, and I think I can see a way through it. But I cannot do it if you keep making decisions without me. She held his gaze. So I'm asking you, right now, trust me with this. Edmund Carter looked at his daughter for a long time. He saw something in her face that he hadn't let himself see before. Something that had been there for years, probably. While he was busy looking past it at the version of her he'd decided she was. What do you need? She exhaled barely. Just enough. I need you to make no decisions about this land. No agreements, no conversations, nothing. Not until I tell you we're ready. And when will that be? Soon, she said. But I need time to do it right. He nodded slowly. It was not a defeated nod. It was the nod of a man making a decision to hand something over. Which was different, and harder, and took more of him than she knew. All right, he said. She stood. Thank you, Papa. She was almost to the door when he said, Amelia. He was looking at his desk. I should have shown you these books years ago, he said. I thought I was protecting you. She was quiet for a moment. I know, I wasn't, he said. I was just making it harder for you to help. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that would make it lighter. She just nodded once and left him sitting with it. Howell turned out to be a small man about 70 who lived alone on the edge of the county and answered the door in his shirt sleeves with a pipe clamped between his teeth and the expression of someone who had been expecting to be left alone and was mildly offended to discover otherwise. He looked at Amelia. He looked at Thomas. He looked back at Amelia. You the Carter girl, he said. Not a question. I am. Heard about that business at Brooks Estate. Most people have. He studied her for another moment. Then stepped back from the door. Come in, then. The inside of his house was organized chaos, maps and survey charts covering every flat surface. Not randomly, but in the specific disorder of a man who knows exactly where everything is and doesn't care what it looks like to anyone else. He moved through it with the ease of long familiarity and settled into a chair by the window and looked at her. What do you want to know? He said. I want to know what's under the western parcel of Carter land, she said. And I want to know why a man named Fulton walked away from a timber lease without explanation 9 years ago. Something moved in the old man's eyes. He took the pipe from his mouth. Who told you about Fulton? Does it matter? It might. He looked at her steadily. That parcel hasn't been properly assessed in 30 years. The last survey was done by a man named Andrews who worked for a land company out of Richmond. Andrews filed a report that called the land moderate timber value. Suitable for agricultural use, no significant mineral deposits. And Howell put the pipe back in his mouth. Took it out again. And Andrews worked for the land company for another 6 years after that. Then he retired very suddenly and bought himself a rather nice property down near the coast. He raised an eyebrow. On a surveyor's salary. Amelia went very still. The report was false. I'm not saying that, mister. Howell, I'm saying, he said carefully, that if someone were to conduct a new and thorough assessment of that parcel by a surveyor with no existing relationship with any land company or interested party, they might find that the previous report had certain gaps. What kind of gaps? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up a folded paper from the stack nearest his chair, reached for it without looking. Which told her he'd had it out recently, which told her he'd been thinking about this already, and handed it to her. It was a geological sketch, old, hand-drawn, detailed in the obsessive way of a man who had looked at something very closely for a very long time. The western parcel was outlined in pencil, along the northern boundary. In the old man's cramped handwriting were 3 words. Potential coal deposits. She looked up. How long have you known about this? She asked. Long enough, he said. Long enough that when young Fulton came to me 9 years ago asking questions, I knew what he'd found, and long enough to know why he walked away. He leaned forward slightly. Because the People who'd want that land if they knew what was under it are not the kind of people you want to be in a dispute with. Miss Carter. They have resources and they have lawyers and they have friends in places that matter. Like Charles Whitaker, she said. The old man didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Amelia looked down at the sketch again, the 3 words in pencil. The neat, careful lines of the northern boundary. She thought about Whitaker in her sitting room. Fair market value. Quick transfer. She thought about 12 years of her family drowning. Slowly, in water that had been quietly channeled around them, by people who knew exactly what was underneath their feet. She thought about her father saying something felt wrong and turning Whitaker down on instinct alone. And the savage irony of a man who'd made nothing but wrong decisions for 12 years, making exactly the right one when it mattered most. For a reason he couldn't even name, Mr. Howell, she said. I need an official assessment, new, thorough, signed. One that can stand up in a legal proceeding if it comes to that. It'll come to that, he said. I know. I need it studied her. It'll take time. And it'll cost. I'm aware. She met his eyes. Will you do it? The old man was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the sketch in her hands. He looked at Thomas. Standing by the door with his hat in his hands, he looked back at her. Your grandfather, he said finally, was a good man. Helped me out of a situation once, years back, before you were born. Never asked for anything in return. He took the pipe from his mouth and set it on the arm of the chair. I reckon I can do this for his granddaughter. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me when we see what Whitaker does when he finds out. He found out faster than she expected. She didn't know how. She would spend a long time afterward trying to trace the exact path from Howell's house to Whitaker's ear. And she never found it completely. But 4 days after her visit to the old assessor, she was walking the fence line of the eastern field when she heard a rider coming and looked up and saw one of Whitaker's men dismounting at her front gate. Not Whitaker himself. That was deliberate, she understood immediately. Sending a man rather than coming himself was a message. It said, I don't need to be here for this. This is routine for me. The man handed her a letter. She read it standing at the gate with the morning sun on her face. And she kept her expression exactly even, because she'd had practice at that by now. The letter was from a lawyer in Richmond. It stated, in precise and courteous legal language, that a review of the Carter family's outstanding loan obligations had determined that the primary note, the one secured against the western parcel, was now past its modified grace period and would be called in full within 30 days. It further stated that the holder of the note was prepared to accept a transfer of the collateral property in lieu of payment, and that this offer should be considered against the circumstances. The holder of the note. She had read those loan documents twice. The holder of the note had been listed as a land investment company out of Richmond. The name unremarkable and unmemorable enough that she'd moved past it without stopping. She pulled the original loan papers from memory, the company name. She set it against Whitaker's name and turned both of them in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle she'd been missing the center of. She looked at the writer, who was waiting with the patient boredom of a man who delivered letters he didn't read. Tell your employer, she said pleasantly, that I received his letter and will be responding through legal counsel. The writer blinked. You have legal counsel? I will, she said, in the same pleasant tone. By the time any response would be expected, he rode away. She stood at the gate for 30 seconds after he was gone, alone with the full weight of what had just happened. And then she made herself breathe slowly and think clearly. Because panic was a luxury she could not afford. Whitaker didn't just want to buy the land. He already held the debt against it. He had been patient for 2 years, letting the interest compound, letting the situation worsen. And now he'd decided the moment had arrived to collect. He'd seen the engagement fail. He'd calculated that without Nathaniel Brooks' money backing the Carter family, there was nothing standing between him and that parcel. He was not wrong about the situation. He was wrong about her. She walked back to the house. Finding a lawyer willing to take her case on terms she could afford turned out to be an education. The first man she approached, a well-regarded attorney in town, listened to her for 10 minutes and then told her gently that her situation was difficult. The note appeared valid, and he was not sure that it might not done in 30 days. She thanked him for his time. The second man she approached did not listen for 10 minutes. He listened for approximately 3 and then explained that perhaps she should consider whether accepting Whitaker's offer might be the most practical path forward for her family. She thanked him for his time as well. The third man was younger than the others. His name was Daniel Marsh, and he operated out of a small office above a dry goods store. And he had the look of someone who had been told no often enough that he'd stopped letting it discourage him. She'd gotten his name from Clara Monroe, who'd gotten it from her cousin, who'd said simply that Marsh was stubborn and smart and had never yet lost a case he believed in. She walked in without an appointment. He looked up from his desk. He was maybe 30, sharp-eyed with ink on his left hand and the focused expression of a man interrupted in the middle of something. "I need legal counsel," she said. "I have 30 days in a situation that 2 other attorneys have told me is hopeless." "Which I don't believe. If you're interested, I'd like to make my case." He set his pen down. "Sit down, miss." Amelia Carter. Something shifted in his expression, recognition, followed by quick assessment. He'd heard her name. Everyone had heard her name by now. She watched him decide something. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything, the loans, the Western parcel, the fraudulent survey from 30 years ago, Howell and the coal deposits, Whitaker's company holding the note, the letter that had arrived that morning. She told him all of it in order. Clearly, without dramatics, the way she'd taught herself to think about it in the 3 days since she'd read Howell's sketch. When she finished, Marsh was quiet for a moment. "The geological assessment," he said. "Do you have documentation?" "Howell is conducting a formal one now. I expect it within 2 weeks. And the original survey, the Andrews report. Can we establish a connection between Andrews and any entity linked to Whitaker?" "Andrews retired on a surveyor's salary and bought coastal property," she said. "I believe there's a trail. I haven't had the resources to follow it." "I have resources," Marsh said slowly. "And I have contacts in Richmond who know the land company records." He looked at her steadily. "If what you're describing is accurate, if Whitaker's company suppressed the mineral assessment, influenced the original survey, and positioned itself to acquire the property through debt they deliberately allowed to worsen, that is fraud." "Miss Carter, that is not a civil dispute. That is a criminal matter. I know what it is," she said. "It's also," he said carefully, "a case that would put you directly in opposition to one of the most connected men in this county. I know that too, and you still want to pursue it." She looked at him. "Mr. Marsh, someone has been stealing from my family for 30 years. They used fake documents and paid off surveyors and patient timing. And they waited for the moment we were weakest to move in, for what they'd been planning all along." She leaned forward slightly. "I am not asking whether to pursue it. I am asking whether you're willing to help me do it right." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. "Tell me about Howell," he said. "Everything. From the beginning." She walked out of Marsh's office an hour later and stood in the street and let herself feel, for just a moment, the particular dizziness of having done something that cannot be undone. She had a lawyer. She had a case. She had 30 days and a geological assessment and a retired surveyor who owed her grandfather a debt. And she had the kind of anger that doesn't run out. What she did not have was enough. Not yet. She needed time. She needed the assessment completed and witnessed, and filed in a form that couldn't be quietly buried. She needed Marsh to find the connection between Andrews and Whitaker's company. She needed the loan note challenged on grounds that would hold under scrutiny. And she needed all of that before Whitaker decided that waiting for 30 days was no longer in his interest. Clara Monroe found her standing in the street. Clara was one of those people who appeared precisely when she was needed. which was either a gift or an unerring instinct for where trouble was concentrated. She took one look at Amelia's face and fell into step beside her without a word. They walked half a block before Clara said, "Tell me," Amelia told her. "All of it, Howell. The coal deposits, the fraudulent survey." Whitaker holding the note, Marsh in his pen and his Richmond contacts. Clara listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Amelia loved most about her. When she finished, Clara said, "You need the farmers." Amelia looked at her. "The ones who work the land around yours," Clara said. "The ones who've been watching Whitaker's men ride those roads for 2 years. They know things, Amelia. They see things. And if Whitaker has been operating the way you think he hasn't been doing it only to your family." She met her eyes. "Let me help. I know half those families. Let me go talk to them." "Clara, don't tell me to stay out of it," Clara said firmly. "I watched you put that ring down and walk out of Brooks Estate, and I thought that woman is finally done being quiet. I am not going to stand on the sidelines while she fights Whitaker alone." Amelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If Whitaker finds out you're involved, he'll find out I'm your friend," Clara said. "He already knows that. It doesn't change anything." She raised an eyebrow. "Does it change anything for you?" Amelia looked at her. This woman who had been her friend since they were children, who had never once told her to be smaller or quieter or more convenient. "No," she said. "It doesn't change anything." Clara nodded briskly. "Good. Then stop wasting time and tell me which families to start with." The next 2 weeks moved at a pace that left Amelia no room to doubt, which was probably what saved her. She was in the account books by 4 in the morning and out meeting with workers and tenant farmers by 8. She listened more than she talked. She asked questions and took notes and asked more questions. And she discovered, slowly and then all at once, that her father had not been the only man in the county that Whitaker had worked patiently against. There were 3 other families with stories that rhymed with theirs land that had been underassessed, loans that had been quietly maneuvered into less favorable terms, moments of vulnerability that had been waited for with the careful patience of a man playing a long game. None of those families had talked to each other about it, because men like Whitaker understood that isolation was half the strategy, that people who felt alone in a bad situation made worse decisions, moved faster than they should, accepted less than they deserved because they believed no one else was watching. Amelia started introducing those families to each other. Clara moved through the county the way she always moved, with the comfortable ease of a woman everyone liked, asking questions that didn't sound like questions. She brought back names and dates and details that fit into Marsh's case like pieces of a structure that had always been there, waiting for someone to trace its shape. Marsh, for his part, turned out to be exactly what Clara's cousin had promised. He worked at a pace that impressed her and asked questions that showed he'd been thinking about the case between their meetings. And one afternoon he came to the house with a look on his face that she'd learned to recognize, the specific expression of a man who has just found something important. "Andrews," he said, sitting down at the writing desk across from her. He worked for a land company called Meridian Holdings for 6 years after filing the Carter survey. Meridian Holdings dissolved 12 years ago. Its assets and partnerships were absorbed by 2 successor companies, one of which, he set a paper on the desk and pushed it toward her, is the entity currently holding your family's loan note. Amelia looked at the paper. She looked at Marsh. "That is," she said carefully. "A direct line," he said. "It won't be easy to prove. Their lawyers will argue Meridian's dissolution severed any liability, but as evidence of a pattern, as context for a fraud claim, as the kind of thing that makes a judge pay very close attention to everything else we're saying." He leaned back. "It is exactly what we needed." She pressed her hands flat on the desk, breathed. "How long do we have before the 30 days is up?" 11 days. "And Howell's assessment?" He told Thomas. "It'll be ready in 8. 3 days of margin." Barely enough. She thought about Whitaker's face in her sitting room. The comfortable ease of a man who expected to get what he'd come for. File everything the moment we have it, she said. Every piece. Don't wait for a perfect moment, I wasn't planning to, Marsh said. She nodded. Then we're ready. She didn't entirely believe that. But she said it anyway, because there were moments when the distance between what was true and what you needed to be true was small enough to step across. And this was one of them. Nathaniel Brooks heard about the geological assessment on a Thursday morning. It reached him the way things always reached him in Virginia, through a chain of men who knew things and told the right people, eventually arriving at someone who thought Nathaniel ought to know. The man who told him was one of his own attorneys, who had it from a colleague in Marsh's building, who had apparently been less discreet than he should have been. Nathaniel stood in his study and listened to the account coal deposits. Fraudulent survey, Whitaker's company holding the note, and felt something happen in his chest that he wasn't entirely prepared for. Not surprise, he knew Whitaker. He knew exactly what Whitaker was capable of when land was involved. Because he had been in the room once, years ago, when Whitaker had described his methods to a mutual acquaintance in the comfortable tone of a man who didn't expect to be judged for them. What he felt was something closer to he didn't have a clean word for it. Anger, partly, at Whitaker for the fraud, at himself, for a reason he wasn't quite ready to name. He thought about Amelia Carter sitting across from Whitaker in her family sitting room, and he had heard about that meeting too. The county talked. And the county had been talking about Amelia Carter with increasing frequency and increasing respect for 2 weeks now. He thought about her walking Whitaker to the door. He thought about what it would have taken to sit across from that man with 30 days on a loan clock and tell him no. He sat down behind his desk. He had resources. He had legal contact. He had relationships in Richmond that could move faster than Marsh's. And he had the particular authority of a man whose name made other men pay attention. He could end Whitaker's game before Howell's assessment even had to be filed. He could walk into this and be the solution, but he picked up his pen and set it down again. He thought about her face at the dining room table. A man can only see as far as his imagination reaches. He thought about what it would mean to her, to everything she was building, if he walked in now with his resources and his name and solved it cleanly, the way he'd always solved things. What it would cost her if the story ended that way. If the woman who had spent her whole life being someone else's solution became, again, someone else's saved thing. He sat with that for a long time. Then he called his attorney. I want to know everything about the Meridian Holdings succession, he said. Quietly. Don't involve Whitaker's people, and don't do anything with what you find until I tell you to. I just want to know the shape of it. May I ask why? Because knowledge, Nathaniel said, is not the same as interference. He set the pen down and stood at the window again. And this time what he thought about was not the ring on the table or the walk across the dining room floor. He thought about an 11 days deadline and a woman who had decided to stop waiting to be saved, and the very specific restraint it was going to take to let her. He pressed his fingers to the cool glass. Come on, he said. To no one in particular in the empty room. It was the closest he had come in a long time to hoping for something he had no control over. Howell's assessment arrived on the 8th day. Thomas brought it to the house before sunrise, which told Amelia everything she needed to know about how seriously the old man was taking it. He didn't send a messenger. He came himself, riding out in the dark with the document wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside his coat like something worth protecting. She was already awake. She had barely slept in 3 days. She took the document from Thomas at the front door and stood in the hallway and read it right there. In her nightgown, with the lamp Thomas held casting unsteady light across the pages. She read every line. She read the geological notations she only half understood, and the survey coordinates she'd memorized from the old maps, and the formal assessor's language that wrapped the truth in careful professional distance. The truth was this: the northern boundary of the Carter Western parcel sat directly above one of the most promising coal seams in central Virginia. Howell estimated its value conservatively at 4 times what Whitaker's company had offered for the entire property. 4 times. She stood in the hallway and breathed. "Miss Amelia." "Get Marsh," she said. "Now, I don't care what time it is." Thomas was already turning for the door. She sat down on the bottom stair and held the document in both hands and thought, with the cold precision that had replaced feelings somewhere around day 5 of this, about what Whitaker was going to do when he found out she had it. Because he was going to find out. Men like Whitaker always found out. The question was not whether but when, and whether she could move fast enough in the space between. She had 3 days left on the 30-day notice. 3 days to file. To challenge, to get this in front of someone with the authority to stop the clock. She stood up. She went upstairs and dressed in the dark, and came back down and started writing. Marsh arrived within the hour, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either, or he'd been sleeping lightly enough that Thomas's knock had reached him fast. He came through the door with his coat half-buttoned, and his hair uncombed and his eyes completely alert. And he took the assessment from her and read it standing at the writing desk without sitting down. He read it twice. "This is enough," he said. "Is it enough to stop the 30-day notice? It's enough to file an injunction challenging the validity of the original survey and by extension the collateral claim on the parcel." He set the document down. "If the court accepts, and with this, it freezes the loan action until the challenge is resolved. How long does that take? Months. Possibly longer. And Whitaker can't move on the land during that time? Not without being in contempt of court." She let that settle. Months. Whitaker frozen in place for months while Marsh built the fraud case, while the other families came forward, while the connection between Andrews and Meridian Holdings made its way into formal documentation that couldn't be buried. "File it today," she said. "I was planning to file it the moment the courthouse opens." He looked at her. "There's something else." His tone had shifted, not alarmed, but careful in the way she'd learned, meant he was about to say something she needed to sit with. "What?" she said. "Whitaker's attorney filed a motion yesterday evening," Marsh said. "I got word of it an hour ago, which is why I was still awake when Thomas came. He's arguing that the 30-day notice was actually issued 32 days ago. Not 30, which would put the default date as of this morning rather than 3 days from now." The room went very quiet. "He moved the date," she said. "He's claiming a clerical error in the original notification." "There was no clerical error, I know that. Can he do this?" Marsh was quiet for a moment. "He can try. Whether it holds depends on which judge receives it and how quickly we can demonstrate the notification date." He met her eyes steadily. "We have the letter. We have the date it was delivered. Thomas can testify to receiving it. It's disputable. But it means we don't have 3 days, Amelia. We have this morning." She stared at him. Then she said very quietly, "That man moved the date. Yes, he knew we were close. Yes, so he manufactured a reason to take the clock away, yes." She stood up from the desk. She walked to the window. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside it and stared at nothing and thought about Whitaker in her sitting room, with his pleasant manners and his 2 outriders and his absolute certainty that this was already over. She thought about her grandfather's land, about 30 years of patience and strategy and quiet fraud. About her father signing contracts without reading them, and her family slowly sinking, and nobody ever thinking to ask her if she could see a way through. She turned around. "What do you need from me right now?" she said. "The original letter. The envelope with the delivery date if you kept it. Anything Thomas can confirm about when it arrived. I kept everything." She was already moving toward the desk. "I have kept every single piece of paper since the day Whitaker first walked through my door." Marsh almost smiled. "I had a feeling." She pulled the letter from the file she'd organized 3 nights ago, organized the way she organized everything now, with the neat precision of someone who understood that documentation was armor. She handed it to him. She handed him the envelope. She handed him the note she'd written to herself the same evening, recording the date and time of delivery and the name of the writer. Because some instinct she hadn't known, she had told her to write it down. Marsh looked at the note. He looked at her. "You wrote this the same day it arrived," he said. "Within 2 hours. In your own hand, dated." Yes, he tucked it carefully with the other documents. "Then we have him on the date. This note alone disputes his clerical error claim." He straightened. "I'll be at the courthouse when it opens. You stay here. Don't speak to anyone from Whitaker's side today, not a writer. Not a letter. Nobody. Anything they hold, and you don't respond until you hear from me. Understood." He picked up his bag. At the door he paused. "You know this isn't over when we file today." "I know. He'll escalate." "I know that too." Marsh looked at her for a moment. "Most people," he said quietly, "would have taken his offer." "I'm not most people," she said. He nodded once. "No," he said, "you are not," and he left. The courthouse opened at 8. By 9, Amelia knew the injunction had been filed because Tom came back from town with that specific look on his face that meant the thing had been done and could not be undone, and the world had shifted slightly on its axis. By 10, Whitaker knew. She was in the account books when she heard the rider coming hard up the drive, and she did not go to the window. She sat exactly where she was and kept her pen moving and waited. Her father appeared in the doorway. "There's a man outside. Don't speak to him," she said. Without looking up, "Send him away and tell him any communication goes through Daniel Marsh." Edmund Carter looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he went and did exactly what she'd said. She heard raised voices from the front of the house. Her father's, measured and firm. A stranger's, impatient and increasingly less pleasant. Then the sound of a horse leaving fast, hooves hard on the dry ground. Her father came back. "He left a message," Edmund said. "Verbally. He said to tell you that Whitaker is a patient man, but has limits." Amelia kept writing. Noted, Amelia. Her father came into the room and sat down across from her. His voice was different now, not frightened, but serious in the way he hadn't been serious about anything in years. "I need to understand how bad this is about to get." She set down her pen. She looked at him. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," she said. "Whitaker doesn't lose things quietly. He's going to push back hard, lawyers. Pressure, possibly rumors. He'll try to make this comfortable enough that we decide it's not worth it. Is it worth it? Papa." She held his gaze. "He has been stealing from this family for 30 years. The land that grandfather built is sitting on top of a coal seam that could sustain us for generations. And Whitaker knew that and suppressed it and maneuvered us into debt so he could take it." She paused. "It is worth it." Edmund Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "Your grandfather would have liked you," he said. He was the same way. Once he knew something was right, he didn't much care how hard it got. She didn't say anything. She picked up her pen, but her hand was not quite as steady as it had been. The pressure from Whitaker came in the way she'd predicted, and faster than she'd hoped. Within 48 hours of the injunction filing, 3 things happened in quick succession. A prominent merchant in town, who did considerable business with Whitaker's various interests, quietly let it be known that he would no longer be extending the Carter family their usual credit arrangements. A rumor began circulating through the county that Amelia Carter had fabricated the geological assessment. That old Howell had gone senile and couldn't be trusted. And that the whole case was a desperate attempt by a ruined family to avoid legitimate debt. And a letter arrived from the county's most established law firm informing Daniel Marsh that they had been retained by the opposing party and intended to file a counter-motion challenging Howell's credentials. And the chain of custody of the assessment document. Amelia read all 3 pieces of news in the same afternoon. She sat with them for exactly as long as it took her to understand each one. Then she stood up and went to find Clara. Clara was in the Monroe's front parlor when Amelia arrived. And she took one look at Amelia's face and sent her housekeeper out of the room. "Tell me," Clara said. Amelia told her. "The credit withdrawal. The rumor, the counter-motion." Clara listened without moving. When Amelia finished, Clara said, "The rumor is the most dangerous, I know, because the law will take time. But people make up their minds fast. She was thinking. Working through it the way she worked through problems, fast and practical. We need people to say publicly what they know about Whitaker. Not what they suspect, what they know. The other families are scared, Clara said. That's why they haven't spoken yet. They need to see someone stand first. She met Amelia's eyes. And they need to see that the person standing doesn't get knocked down. I'm still standing, Amelia said. Then make sure they see it, Clara said simply. All of them. She walked home in the late afternoon and thought about what it meant to be visible when visibility felt like a target. She thought about the engagement dinner, the room full of people watching her. All those eyes, and how she'd walked the length of that room and not hurried once. She could do that again. She had done it once already. She could do it as many times as it required. The first family came forward on a Wednesday. It was the Hendersons, a farming family from the county's western edge. People who had worked the same land for 2 generations and had spent the last 4 years in a quiet and bewildering dispute over a timber contract that had somehow ended up costing them considerably more than it should have. Mrs. Henderson was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of about 50 who had driven herself to Marsh's office in a wagon without telling her husband first, which Amelia respected enormously. She sat across from Marsh's desk and looked at Amelia and said, I heard what you're doing. I want to know if our situation is connected. Amelia walked her through what they knew. The surveyor network, the land company succession. The pattern of targeting families at moments of financial vulnerability. She watched Mrs. Henderson's face as the pieces clicked into place, that particular expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time and is experiencing the specific relief and fury of being proven right. The timber contract, Mrs. Henderson said. It was handled by an agent who worked for a company out of Richmond. Do you remember the company name? Marsh asked. She did. It was one of Meridian Holdings' successors. Marsh wrote it down, his pen moved quickly. I'll testify, Mrs. Henderson said. She said it the way people say things when they've been waiting to say them for a long time. Flat and certain and past the point of fear, whatever you need. I'll say what happened to us. By the end of that week, 2 more families had come forward. By the end of the following week, there were 5. The rumor about Howell began losing its air because Howell himself, who had heard about it from Thomas, who had heard about it in town, walked into the courthouse on a Thursday morning and filed a sworn affidavit attesting to his credentials, his methodology, and the accuracy of his findings, signed by 3 other former county assessors who vouched for his professional standing. Whitaker's attorneys filed an objection. The judge overruled it in 2 days. Small victory, but victories had a sound, and she was learning to hear them. The twist came on a Friday afternoon, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. She was at Marsh's office when his clerk knocked and came in with a folded note. And Marsh read it and went very still in a way she'd learned to pay attention to. What is it? She said. He looked up. The judge assigned to the injunction hearing, he said. He's recused himself. She stared. Why? The motion says personal reasons. No further explanation. That she stopped. Whitaker, I don't know that, Marsh. He set the note down. I don't know it. I suspect it. There's a difference. And right now the difference matters, because what I suspect I can't use and what I know I can. He looked at her steadily. The case gets reassigned. That takes time. It could push the hearing back by weeks. We don't have weeks. The injunction only holds. I know how long it holds. His voice was calm. Let me make some calls. I have a contact in the circuit who may be able to expedite the reassignment. It's not guaranteed. But I'm not sitting still, and neither should you. She stood up. She sat back down. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. Someone got to the judge, she said, possibly. Which means Whitaker knows the case is stronger than he expected. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. That's one way to read it. It's the right way to read it. She felt the anger move through her. Clean and useful and by now familiar. A man who was confident he was going to win doesn't need to interfere with the judge. That argument, Marsh said carefully, can be made in court. Then make it. I intend to. She left his office and walked out into the street, and kept walking, because standing still was not something she was capable of right now. She walked 3 blocks before she realized she was heading nowhere in particular. And she stopped and stood on the side of the road and looked up at the sky and made herself breathe. Someone touched her arm. It was Clara, who had apparently been behind her for at least a block. "I followed you from Marsh's," Clarissa said. "You were walking like a woman who needed someone to follow her." Amelia looked at her friend. She felt something crack slightly in the composure she'd been maintaining for 3 weeks. And she let it just for a moment, just enough. "He got to the judge," she said. Clara's face did something complicated. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure of anything. I just know the judge recused, and I know Whitaker is running out of legal options, and I know what men like him do when they run out of legal options." She pressed her fingers against her eyes. "I am so tired, Clara. I know. I am so tired, and I am not stopping, and I just need to be tired without someone needing me to be something else." Clara put her hand on Amelia's arm. She didn't say anything reassuring. She didn't say it was going to be fine, or that Amelia was strong, or that they'd get through this. She just stood there, present and solid, and let the moment be what it was. After a minute, Amelia dropped her hands. "All right," she said. "What do I do about the judge?" "Nothing," Clara said. "That's Marsh's fight. What you do is keep building what you're building. Because that's what Whitaker can't stop no matter how many judges he gets to." She looked at her. "The families who've come forward, their testimony doesn't go away because the hearing is delayed. Howell's assessment doesn't go away. Marsh's documentation doesn't go away. None of it goes away, it just—" Amelia absorbed that. "You're right," she said. "I usually am," Clarissa said. "You just don't always have time to notice." The reassignment took 9 days. 9 days during which Whitaker's side filed 3 separate motions, all of which Marsh answered methodically and without apparent stress, which Amelia found both impressive and slightly unnerving, given what she knew about the situation. She asked him about it once, near the end of the 2nd week, and he looked up from his papers and said, "Panic is what they're trying to cause. The moment we respond to volume instead of substance, we lose focus. So I answer what matters and I ignore what doesn't." She filed that away. She would use it later, in a different context, in ways she didn't yet know. The new judge was a man named Calloway. Marsh came to the house the morning after the reassignment was confirmed, and the look on his face when he walked through the door was different from anything she'd seen from him before. "Quieter, more careful, tell me," she said. "Calloway is a fair man," Marsh said. "Genuinely. He's not connected to Whitaker's network as far as I can determine. And he has a record of ruling on evidence rather than relationship." He paused. "He's also the judge who ruled against the Meridian Holdings predecessor company in a timber dispute 8 years ago." She went very still. "He's ruled against them before, on a different matter. But yes, does Whitaker know this? He must, which means he'll be moving to have Calloway recused as well." "On what Grier ruling creating bias?" Marsh sat down. "It's a weak argument, but he'll make it. Calloway will likely deny it. But the motion itself buys Whitaker more time." He looked at her. "This is becoming a war of attrition, Amelia. He's trying to delay long enough that we run out of resources or resolve. Whichever comes first." She thought about the credit that had been withdrawn. The account books she'd been working every morning to stretch what they had further. The small economies her mother had started making without being asked, quietly and without complaint, because Margaret Carter had decided somewhere in the last 3 weeks that she was going to be useful. "How long can we sustain the legal costs?" she asked. "If the Henderson family and the others contribute, as they've indicated, several more months." "And Whitaker?" "Longer than us," Marsh said plainly. "That's the reality of it. In a prolonged fight, he has more staying power." She was quiet. "So we need to win it before it becomes prolonged," she said. "Yes, which means we need to make the fraud case visible enough that it becomes a public matter. Not just a legal one." She looked at him. "What'd that take?" Marsh was quiet for a moment. A hearing, a real one with testimony, where people can see what Whitaker has been doing, not just read about it in court filings. Then we need to get to the hearing. Yes. How do we get to the hearing faster? He looked at her steadily. We need something that makes delay politically costly for him. Something that makes it worse for him to wait than to proceed. He tapped his pen on the desk. The other family's testimonies are powerful, but they need a forum. Right now they're affidavits in a file. They need to be voices in a room. She thought about that. She thought about rooms and voices and who controlled which. What if, she said slowly, we went to the county commissioners' meeting? Next month's is open session. Anyone can speak. Marsh looked up. It's not a court, she continued, but it's a public record. If the Henderson family and the others stand up in an open session and describe what happened to them, it's documented, it's visible, and it puts pressure on the legal from outside the legal process. It could also provoke Whitaker into escalating. He's already escalating, she said. At least this way the escalation happens in public, where everyone can see it. She held Marsh's gaze. He's been operating in private for 30 years. Darkness is his advantage. I want to take it away. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. That, he said, is either the smartest thing or the most dangerous thing I've heard in this case. Can it be both? He almost smiled. In my experience, usually is. The night before the commissioners' meeting, Nathaniel Brooks appeared at her door. She had not seen him since the engagement dinner. She had thought about him not as much as she might have expected. Given everything, but in the quiet moments between the account books and the legal filings, and the conversations with farmers and lawyers and frightened families, she had thought about him, about the window he stood at, about what he did or didn't do with what he knew. Thomas announced him. Amelia set down her pen, smoothed her dress, and went to the sitting room. Nathaniel stood by the fireplace. He looked different than he had at the dinner, not less composed. But the composition was different, less armored, more like a man who had decided to show up to something without knowing exactly what it was going to cost him. He looked at her. Miss Carter, Mr. Brooks. She sat down. She did not offer refreshment. She did not make it easier or warmer than it was. What brings you here? He was quiet for a moment. She could see him adjusting, not retreating, just recalibrating. She'd spent 3 weeks doing it herself and recognized the motion. I know what you're doing, he said. With the case. With the commissioners' meeting tomorrow. Most of the county seems to know. I know about Meridian Holdings, he said. And the Andrews survey. And Whitaker's note on your loan. He met her eyes. I had my attorney look into the succession documents. She looked at him. Steady. Why? Because when I heard what Whitaker was doing, he said, I wanted to understand the shape of it. And what did you find? That it's even more deliberate than you've been able to prove yet, he said. There are 2 additional land parcels in the county with suppressed assessments. Different families. Different timelines, same pattern. He paused. My attorney documented it. The documentation is thorough. Amelia sat very still. You've been building a parallel case, she said. I've been gathering information. Why didn't you bring it to Marsh? He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. Because I wasn't sure you'd want it, he said. From me. The room was quiet. She thought about what it would mean to take what he was offering. What it meant that he'd done it, that he'd sat across the county in his study and put his attorneys to work on her problem without telling her, without expecting thanks, without making it about himself. She thought about the kind of man who does that. She thought about the kind of man who calls a woman suitable in front of 40 people. She thought about how those 2 things existed in the same person, and what it meant that they did. What are you asking for? She said. Nothing, he said. I'm not asking for anything. That's not entirely true, she said. You came here tonight instead of sending the documents through Marsh. You came here and told me yourself. That means something. He didn't deny it. He just looked at her. I want to give you what I have, he said. And I want you to decide what to do with it. That's all. She held his gaze for a long moment. Bring the documentation to Marsh's office tomorrow morning before 9, she said. He'll know how to use it. Nathaniel nodded. He picked up his hat from the chair. At the door he stopped. He turned back. For what it's worth, he said. And his voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before, something that had been stripped of the careful control and was just the truth, underneath what I said at that dinner. The way I said it, Mr. Brooks. I'm not asking you to respond, he said. I'm just saying I know what it was, and I know it wasn't worth what it cost you. He held her gaze. I'm sorry. 2 words. Simple. Direct, offered without negotiation or expectation of response. The way a man apologizes when he means it and isn't expecting it to fix anything. She said nothing. She didn't know yet what to do with it. He nodded once and went to the door, and Thomas was there to open it. And Nathaniel Brooks walked out into the dark. Amelia sat in the sitting room for a long time after the sound of his horse faded. She was going to face Whitaker in a public room tomorrow, with 5 families standing beside her, with Marsh's documentation and now Nathaniel's, with Howell's assessment signed and witnessed and filed in triplicate. She was as ready as she was going to be. She picked up her pen. She turned back to her papers, and somewhere in the county, Whitaker was doing the same planning, adjusting, calculating the next move in a game he had always expected to win. The difference between them, she thought, was simple. He had been playing this game for 30 years. She had been playing it for 3 weeks. And she was still standing. The commissioner's meeting room was full before 8 in the morning. Amelia knew it before she arrived, because Thomas had come back from town an hour early with that particular set to his jaw that meant something had shifted. People had been talking since the night before. Word had moved through the county the way word always moved in Virginia, fast and thorough, and impossible to stop once it got started, and what it carried this time was the shape of something people had been waiting to see, without knowing they were waiting. She walked in with Marsh on one side and Clara on the other. And the room turned the way rooms turned for her now, not the way it had turned at Brooks Estate. When people looked, because she was attached to Nathaniel's arm, and they were cataloging her deficiencies. This time they turned, because she was the reason they'd come. She felt the difference in her bones. The Henderson family was already seated in the second row. Mrs. Henderson caught her eye and nodded once, that same flat, certain nod from Marsh's office, the nod of a woman who has decided and doesn't intend to undecide. Behind her were the other families, 5 of them, people who had driven out before sunrise because they'd been told no one would listen for years and had finally found someone willing to stand first. Amelia sat down at the front. She opened her folio. She arranged her papers with the same careful precision she brought to everything now. The precision of someone who understood that composure was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it without letting it show. On the far side of the room, Charles Whitaker sat with his 2 attorneys. He was dressed as impeccably as he always was, and his face wore the patient expression of a man at a meeting he considers a minor inconvenience on the way to an outcome he's already determined. He did not look at her when she came in. That told her everything she needed to know about how worried he was. Men who weren't worried looked. They met your eyes to demonstrate they could afford to. Men who were calculating their next move looked at the middle distance and thought. Whitaker was thinking very hard. Commissioner Aldridge opened the session at 8 sharp. He was a man in his 60s, careful and procedurally minded. The kind of official who took the formality of open meetings seriously because he understood that the formality was the point. He read the agenda items. He asked if there was new public business. Marsh stood up. There is, Commissioner. I represent the Carter family and several associated parties in a matter of public concern regarding land fraud in this county. We have testimony and documentation we'd like to present for the public record. One of Whitaker's attorneys was on his feet before Marsh had finished the sentence. Commissioner, this is a matter currently before the court. It's entirely inappropriate to. This is an open session, Marsh said. Without raising his voice or turning around, any citizen of this county may present public business. That is the purpose of an open session. Aldridge looked between them. The matter is open for public comment, he said. Proceed. Mr. Marsh, Whitaker's attorney, sat down. His jaw was tight. Amelia watched Whitaker's face and saw nothing change in it, which was itself a kind of answer. Marsh presented for 20 minutes. He was precise and methodical, and made it simple enough that every person in that room could follow it without a legal education. He explained the fraudulent Andrews survey. He explained Meridian Holdings and its successors. He explained the pattern of acquiring land through suppressed assessments and manipulated debt. He explained that 5 families in this county had been targeted by the same methodology over a span of 30 years, and that documentation existed for all of it, and that it was currently before the circuit court. Then he sat down and Mrs. Henderson stood up. She spoke for 7 minutes. She didn't use legal language. She used plain, direct words, the kind that come from a person who has been saving them up for a long time. She described what had happened to her family in the specific detail of someone who remembered every piece of it because she'd had to live with every piece of it. She named dates. She named the agent who'd handled their contract. She named the company he worked for. When she sat down, the room was very quiet. Then the next family stood. And then the next. By the 4th family, Amelia could see something happening in the room. A shift. The particular kind of shift that happens when a group of people who each believed they were alone in a bad situation realized simultaneously that they weren't alone at all. That the bad situation had been manufactured. That the isolation they'd felt had been part of the plan. It was the sound of 30 years of patience unraveling in a public room on a Tuesday morning. Whitaker stood up. The room went even quieter. Commissioner, he said, these are unproven allegations from parties with a financial interest in defaming me. I will not dignify them with a detailed response here. The courts exist for this purpose, and I am confident in the legal process. He looked at Aldridge with the steady authority of a man who has stood in rooms like this many times and always come out the same way. I would ask that this meeting proceed to its legitimate agenda. Aldridge looked at him. Then he looked at the room. Then he looked at Amelia. She had not spoken yet. She hadn't planned to. Marsh had advised her to let the families carry the testimony, to hold herself back, to be the organizing presence rather than the voice. But something in Aldridge's look told her this was the moment. She stood. Commissioner, she said, I have one thing to add. Whitaker's attorney moved to object. Aldridge held up his hand. Miss Carter, she looked at Whitaker. Directly, without heat, without drama, the same way she'd looked at him across her sitting room table when he'd called her position precarious. Mr. Whitaker came to my home 6 weeks ago, she said. He offered to buy the Carter Western parcel at what he called fair market value. He described himself as a man trying to help a family in difficulty. She paused. What he did not mention was that his company held the debt on that parcel. What he did not mention was that 30 years ago, a surveyor working for his predecessor company filed a false assessment of that same land, hiding the presence of a coal seam that makes it worth 4 times what he offered me. She held his gaze. He didn't mention those things because he didn't expect me to find them out. He expected me to be grateful. The room was very still. I am not grateful, she said simply, and neither are these families. She sat down. Whitaker said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, the first time he had looked at her directly since she'd walked in, and she read his face clearly now. Not the comfortable certainty from her sitting room. Something tighter, something that recognized, perhaps for the first time, that the woman across from him was not going to run out of fight before he ran out of strategy. He looked away first. The meeting moved on. But the room had changed, and everyone in it felt it, and some things that change in a room don't change back. Nathaniel's documentation reached Marsh's desk before 9 that morning, delivered by his personal attorney with a handwritten note that said simply, Use it however it's most useful. No conditions. Read the note. He read the documentation. Then he came to find Amelia, who was in a conversation with Mrs. Henderson outside the meeting room. He waited until Mrs. Henderson had gone. Then he handed her the note. She read it, she folded it, she put it in her folio. "How significant is the documentation?" she asked. "It fills the gaps," Marsh said. The two additional parcels he identified they're documented well enough to extend the pattern from 3 instances to 5, which changes the legal argument from a dispute over one family's land to a systematic fraud claim. He looked at her. "With this, we're not just defending your family, we're prosecuting his." She absorbed that. "He knew what it would do to the case," she said. "Yes." He handed it over anyway. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "File it," she said. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks during which Whitaker's side filed 4 more motions, all of which Marsh answered with the same unshakable efficiency that Amelia had come to rely on, the way you rely on a good foundation, not because you think about it constantly, but because you know it's there. 3 weeks during which the county shifted, slowly and then faster, in the particular way that public opinion shifts when a story becomes undeniable. People who had done business with Whitaker for years began to create distance. Not dramatically. Virginia society did not do dramatic reversals openly, but the kind of small, significant distances that meant something. Invitations not extended. Conversations that ended when he approached. The particular chill of a community that is collectively reconsidering something it had accepted for too long. Amelia felt it. She didn't let herself lean on it. Because public opinion was not evidence, and courts didn't run on sentiment. But she felt it, and it mattered to her more than she'd expected. Not for herself, for the families, for the people who had been isolated and told they were alone in bad situations that had been deliberately manufactured. They were no longer alone. The county could see that now. Nathaniel came to the house again on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks before the hearing. This time he knocked and waited, which was different from his previous visit in a way she noticed without commenting on. Thomas let him in, and she came to the sitting room, and they sat across from each other the way they had not sat since the engagement dinner, which seemed, looking at him now, like something that had happened to different people in a different world. "I heard the commissioners' meeting went well," he said. "It went exactly as it needed to," she said. "Your documentation helped." He looked at her steadily. "How are you, Amelia?" The use of her first name was deliberate. She knew, not presumptuous. He said it carefully, like something he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to. But direct, more direct than he'd been in all the months of their arrangement. When he had called her Miss Carter, with the formal precision of a man keeping things at the distance he preferred. She considered the question, not the social version of it. She'd lost patience for social versions of things around week 2 of the legal battle. She considered the real question, which was, how are you actually? "Tired," she said. "Angry sometimes still, clearer than I've ever been." He nodded like that was an honest answer, and he was glad for it. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want a real answer." "All right. Why did you do it?" "The documentation, the attorneys, the work you put into the Meridian succession records." "You didn't have to do any of that. You had no stake in it." He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet of someone composing an answer. The genuine quiet of someone finding one. "I've been asking myself the same question," he said. The honest version of it. He looked at her. "I think when I found out what Whitaker had been doing, what he'd done to your family, what he'd planned to do, something in me needed to do something about it that wasn't about me." He paused. "I'm not explaining it well." "You're explaining it fine," she said quietly. "I've spent my whole life building things," he said. "Making decisions. Moving things around a board to get outcomes I wanted. And I've been good at it. And I told myself that was enough, that being effective was the same as being good." He met her eyes. "That dinner, the way I spoke about you, the look on your face before you stood up." He stopped. "I told myself it was an unfortunate misjudgment." A matter of poor phrasing. I spent 2 weeks telling myself that. And then I heard what you were doing. What you'd built in 3 weeks with nothing but knowledge and refusal and the right kind of anger. He shook his head slightly. And I understood that what I'd done wasn't poor phrasing. It was that I had looked at something extraordinary and decided it was ordinary. Because deciding it was ordinary was convenient for me. He held her gaze. That is not a misjudgment. That is a failure of character. And I don't know how to fix a failure of character except to stop repeating it. The room was quiet. Amelia looked at him. She looked at the man across from her and tried to reconcile him with the man at the head of that dining table. And found to her own surprise that the distance between them was smaller than it had been. Not gone, not erased, but smaller. You could have sent the documentation through Marsh, she said. You didn't have to come here. No, he said, I didn't. Why did you? He looked at her for a long moment. Because I wanted you to know it came from me, he said. Not from an attorney. From me. Because I wanted there to be at least one thing between us that wasn't at arm's length. She held his gaze. She was not ready to give him anything yet. She wasn't sure what she would give him eventually. Or whether eventually would come. But she was honest enough with herself to know that the man sitting across from her now was not the man who had called her suitable. And that honesty required she acknowledge the difference. Come to the hearing, she said. If you want to be useful, be there. He nodded. I'll be there. He picked up his hat. At the door he paused the same pause as before. The same turn back, but this time he didn't say anything. He just looked at her once, briefly, the way you look at something you're not ready to stop looking at. And then he went. She sat in the sitting room for a while after he left, with her hands in her lap and the quiet of the house around her. And she let herself feel what she actually felt, instead of organizing it into something manageable. It was complicated. It was not resolved. It was the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. She picked up her pen and went back to work. The night before the hearing, Whitaker made his last move. She didn't know about it until Clara appeared at her door at 9 in the evening. Having ridden from town in the dark, which was Clara's version of urgency. She came into the sitting room and sat down and told Amelia without preamble. Whitaker had approached 2 of the 5 testifying families privately. Not in person, through intermediaries, carrying an offer. Compensation for their losses, paid quietly, in exchange for withdrawing their testimony before the hearing. 2 of the 5, Amelia sat with that, Clara told her. The Prestons and the Garfields, the 2 most financially strained. The 2 for whom holding out longest had cost the most. Have they accepted? I don't know. I heard about the approach an hour ago. I came straight here. Amelia was already standing. I need to go see them. Amelia, it's 9 o'clock. I know what time it is. She was reaching for her coat. Thomas. Thomas materialized from the hallway. He had the look of a man who had been listening from a respectful distance and was already prepared to move. Get the horse, she said. They went to the Prestons first because they were closer. The family was still awake, a lamp burning in the window, which suggested they hadn't slept either, and when she knocked, Mr. Preston opened the door and looked at her face and stepped back to let her in without asking why she was there at 9 at night. She sat across from him and his wife at their kitchen table, and she spoke plainly. I know about the offer, she said. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I know what these weeks have cost you. I know you have children and land and obligations, and that this fight has been harder for you than it should have had to be. She looked at them both. But I need you to understand something. If Whitaker can buy 2 families out of this hearing, he walks away from 30 years of fraud with nothing but a postponed inconvenience. And he will be more careful next time, and there will be a next time. There is always a next time with men like him. Preston's wife was looking at her hands. Preston was looking at Amelia. He's offering real money, Preston said. Not a promise. Money. We've got debt. Miss Carter. I know that too, she leaned forward. Mr. Preston, what he did to you was wrong. What he did to all of us was wrong. And I cannot promise you that tomorrow goes the way we need it to. I can't promise you the court rules in our favor, or that Whitaker doesn't have another move we haven't seen. I can't promise you anything except this. I am going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, and I am going to stand there until it's done. Whatever it takes. And if you stand with me, every family in this county is going to know that you did. Preston looked at his wife. His wife looked at him. Something passed between them that had the weight and texture of a decision they'd already made once and were making again. "We ain't taking his money," Mrs. Preston said. She said it to her husband. Not to Amelia, like it was something they needed to say to each other. Preston nodded, he said. "We ain't." Amelia exhaled. "Thank you." She went to the Garfields next. It took longer. Mr. Garfield was a more cautious man, slower to decide, more aware of what he stood to lose. She sat at his table for 40 minutes, and she was honest with him in a way she hadn't always been honest with frightened people, because she'd been too careful about protecting them from difficulty. She told him how strong the case was. She told him about the Meridian documentation. She told him about the 2 additional parcels Nathaniel had found. She told him that Whitaker was offering money now because he was afraid of tomorrow, and that a man who is afraid of tomorrow is a man who knows he's going to lose. Garfield listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical and specific, all of them deserving real answers, which she gave him. At the end, he said, "You really think we can win this?" "I do," she said. He looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. "Then we'll be there." She rode home in the full dark with Thomas beside her and said nothing the whole way. Because there was nothing to say. She had done what she could. The rest was tomorrow. She was dressed and at the writing desk by 5 in the morning. She went through everything one more time, not because she didn't know it, but because the act of going through it was itself a form of steadying. The geological assessment, the Andrews connection, the Meridian succession, the 5 families' documented accounts, Nathaniel's 2 additional parcels, Marsh's countermotions. Everything in order, everything witnessed, everything signed and filed in triplicate. Her mother brought her coffee at 6 and stood in the doorway and looked at her the way she had looked at her 6 weeks ago before the engagement dinner. But completely different, not frightened, not warning. Something that had taken weeks to build and was standing fully formed now. "You're ready," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Amelia said. Margaret Carter came in and set the coffee down. She put her hand on Amelia's shoulder briefly, firmly. The hand of a woman who has been humbled by her own daughter and is not too proud to admit it. "Your grandfather would have been sitting right there with you," she said. "Doing exactly what you're doing." Amelia put her hand over her mother's. "Then let's not disappoint him," she said. The courtroom was full by 8:30. She saw them as she came in, the 5 families in their seats. The commissioner's meeting crowd reconstituted and expanded. People who had driven out because they'd heard something was happening and wanted to see it. She saw Howell in a seat near the back, straight-backed and alert despite his age, with the expression of a man who has waited a long time for a particular reckoning. She saw Clara 3 rows from the front, composed and watchful. She saw Nathaniel. He was standing near the back wall. Not seated, which she understood was deliberate. He was not a party to this. He was a witness to it. He met her eyes when she came in and he nodded the single, deliberate nod of a man making a commitment he intends to keep, and she held his gaze for a moment and then went to the front. Whitaker was already there. He looked the same as always, composed, well-dressed, attended by his 2 attorneys. But she'd learned to read the things that didn't change in his face by now. And what she read this morning was the specific stillness of a man who has not slept. Good, she sat beside Marsh. She set her folio on the table and opened it and arranged her papers. And she breathed and she waited. Judge Calloway entered at 9 sharp. The room rose. The room sat. He looked at the room over his glasses, taking in the crowd. the faces, the weight of whatever was in the air, and then he looked at the two tables. "This is the hearing on the Carter injunction and the associated fraud claim," he said. "Mr. Marsh, you may begin." And Amelia Carter, who had walked out of an engagement dinner 6 weeks ago with a bare finger and an anger she didn't yet know how to use, sat at a courtroom table in the county seat of Virginia and listened to everything she had built being laid before a judge. Piece by piece, the way you lay the stones of a foundation deliberately, in order, with the intention of holding up something that would last. Marsh spoke for 30 minutes before Whitaker's lead attorney rose to object to the Meridian documentation on grounds of relevance. Calloway looked at the attorney. He looked at the documentation. He looked at the attorney again. "Overruled," he said. "Continue, Mr. Marsh." Amelia wrote the word "overruled" on the corner of her notepad. Pressed the pen down until it left a mark. Then she turned the page and kept going. The first testimony break came at 11. Mrs. Henderson took the stand and spoke for 22 minutes. And what she said was not dramatic or embellished or calculated for effect. It was just true, specific and detailed and true, the kind of testimony that is more convincing than any rehearsed speech precisely because it carries the texture of lived experience. She named dates, she named the agent, she named the moment she'd known something was wrong, and what she'd done with that knowledge for 4 years because she had no one to bring it to. When she stepped down, the courtroom was very quiet. Whitaker's attorney cross-examined her for 15 minutes. He was skilled. He tried 3 different angles: her memory of specific dates, the role of her husband in the business decisions, the possibility that the unfavorable terms had been agreed to voluntarily. She answered every question directly and without flinching. And when he tried to suggest that she might have misunderstood the contracts she'd signed, she looked at him with the flat, certain patience of a woman who has been told she misunderstood things for 40 years and is done accepting that characterization. "I understand," she said, "exactly what I signed. I signed it because I was told it was the standard arrangement, and I had no reason at the time to believe otherwise. I know now that I was told that deliberately, by a man working for an entity connected to Mr. Whitaker, because the standard arrangement would not have served their purposes." Silence. The attorney said he had no further questions. She stepped down and walked back to her seat without looking at Whitaker. And Amelia thought, that is what courage looks like when it's not performing itself. That is what it looks like when it's just real. She was called to testify at 2 in the afternoon. She had prepared for it with Marsh carefully, going over what she'd say and how she'd say it. She knew what he needed from her, and she knew what the court needed from her, and she sat in the witness chair, and she told the truth, which was the same thing she would have told without preparation, because she had stopped doing anything other than that approximately 6 weeks ago and didn't intend to start again. She described Whitaker's visit to her home. She described the letter and the manipulated date. She described going to Howell, and what Howell had told her, and what the assessment had found. She described Marsh finding the Meridian connection. She described her father telling her he'd refused Whitaker's first approach 2 years ago on instinct alone, and the significance of that instinct in the context of what they now knew. Whitaker's attorney cross-examined her for 25 minutes. He was more aggressive with her than he had been with Mrs. Henderson. She'd expected that, and Marsh had prepared her for it. And she answered every question with the same level steadiness she'd brought to everything since the night she'd walked out of Brooks Estate. When he suggested that her personal animosity toward Whitaker, stemming from the broken engagement and the financial difficulties of her family, might be coloring her interpretation of events, she looked at him and said, "My personal situation did not alter the geological composition of the coal seam. The fraud exists in the rock, Mr. Alderton, not in my feelings about it." Someone in the room made a sound. The judge didn't object. When she stepped down, Marsh was already on his feet. The afternoon ran through 4:30. By the time Calloway called a recess until the following morning, The shape of the case had been established so thoroughly that even Whitaker's two attorneys looked less like men mounting a defense and more like men calculating the cost of the outcome. She walked out of the courthouse with Marsh on one side and Clara on the other. And the evening air hit her face, and she stopped on the steps and just breathed. Clara said nothing. Marsh said nothing. They let her have it. Then she heard a step behind her, and she didn't turn. But she knew from the quality of Thomas's alertness beside her who it was. Nathaniel came to stand at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. Quietly, not performing it, just saying it. She looked down at him. The evening light was soft and the street behind him was full of people moving and talking, and she was tired in a way that went all the way down to her bones. "We're not done yet," she said. He held her gaze. "But what you built today, he can't take that apart overnight. You know that." She did know that. She had known it since the moment Calloway overruled the first objection, and she'd seen something change in the faces of the 5 families sitting in the gallery. The knowledge that they were believed. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. He stepped back. She went down the stairs. And the city closed around her, and she carried everything she'd built. And she did not put it down. She did not sleep the night before the second day of the hearing. Not from fear. That was the thing she noticed lying in the dark with the house quiet around her. She traced her own feelings the way you trace a map you've memorized. Looking for fear, and it wasn't there. What was there was something sharper and cleaner. The particular alertness of someone standing at the edge of something they have built with their own hands, and are about to find out if it holds. She went through everything one more time in her head. The testimony, the documentation, the 5 families, Nathaniel's 2 additional parcels, Howell's assessment in triplicate, Marsh's counter-motions, each one answered before Whitaker's side could finish asking the question. She went through it all, and when she reached the end, she thought, "We did everything right. Whatever happens tomorrow, we did everything right." That was enough to sleep on. She was up at 4, dressed by 5, at the writing desk by 5:15 with her coffee and her folio and the particular stillness of someone who has stopped bracing and started waiting. Her mother came downstairs at 6. She looked at Amelia sitting at the desk and she didn't say anything. She just went to the kitchen and came back with a second cup of coffee and sat in the chair by the window. And they stayed like that together in the quiet until it was time to go. It was the most her mother had ever said to her, without speaking. The courtroom was fuller than the day before. Word had traveled overnight the way it always traveled in Virginia, specifically and fast, and with the particular momentum of a story people sensed was reaching its turning point. There were faces she didn't recognize. There were people who had driven from neighboring counties because someone had told someone who had told someone that something worth seeing was happening in the circuit court. Whitaker was at his table when she arrived. His 2 attorneys were leaning close, speaking quietly, and she watched the 3 of them for a moment before she sat down and read what she saw. The attorneys were doing most of the talking. Whitaker was listening with the still, contained expression of a man who is receiving information he doesn't like and processing it privately while maintaining his surface. She had seen that expression before, on herself in the mirror. 6 weeks ago before the engagement dinner. She turned away and sat down beside Marsh. "Anything overnight," she said quietly. "One thing," Marsh said. He said it in a tone that made her look at him directly. "Late last night, a man named Creighton, he's a land agent, who worked for Meridian Holdings 12 years ago before the dissolution, he contacted my office. He says he wants to speak with us before the hearing resumes." Amelia went very still. "What does he want to say?" He wouldn't give details through the message. But he said he has documentation from the Meridian period that was never filed publicly. Marsh looked at her steadily. He said he's been holding it for 12 years because he didn't think anyone would believe him without someone willing to fight first. The words landed in her chest and settled. Someone had been waiting for someone to stand up first. and then watching to see if they stayed standing. "Where is he?" she said. "Outside. I told him to wait. Bring him in." Creighton was a man in his late 40s, thin and careful, and carrying the particular tightness of someone who has been afraid of something for a long time and has finally decided the fear costs more than the risk. He sat across from her in the small anteroom off the main hall, and he set a leather folder on the table between them, and he told her what was in it before she opened it. Internal correspondence from Meridian Holdings, dated from the period of the Andrews survey. Letters between Meridian's principal partners discussing the Carter Western parcel, specifically the coal seam assessment that Andrews had been instructed to suppress. The financial arrangement made with Andrews in exchange for the falsified report. The long-term strategy for acquiring the parcel through debt management once the family's financial position could be sufficiently weakened. "Why do you have these?" Amelia asked. "I was a filing clerk," Creighton said. "When Meridian dissolved, I was given a week to pack up the records. Most went to the successor companies. Some were supposed to be destroyed." He looked at the folder. "I kept copies. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I just knew what they meant." He met her eyes. "I heard about what you did at the commissioners' meeting. I heard about the families. I thought if she's still standing after all that, maybe these are finally worth something." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about all the people who had been holding pieces of this howl with his geological sketch. Creighton with his folder, the families with their accounts, all of them waiting in isolation for someone to make it safe enough to come forward. "Can you testify to their authenticity?" she said. "I can. I was there. I know what they are and where they came from." She looked at Marsh. Marsh was already writing. "We need to get these authenticated and submitted before Calloway opens the session," he said. "We have 40 minutes. Then we have 40 minutes," she said. "Move." She was still standing in the hall outside Calloway's chambers at 8:55 when the door opened and the bailiff looked out and said the judge would see them. Calloway listened to Marsh present the Creighton documents in 7 minutes. He read the cover letter himself. He read 2 of the internal correspondences. He looked at Creighton, who confirmed their provenance clearly and without flinching. Then he looked at Whitaker's lead attorney, who had been allowed into the chamber and who was now holding himself very carefully still. "Counselor," Calloway said, "do you have a response to these materials?" The attorney said he would need time to review. "You have until 9 o'clock, Calloway said. "The session resumes on schedule." The attorney's composure held, but it held the way ice holds in late March visibly. And not for long. She walked out of Calloway's chambers with Marsh and Creighton, and the moment the door closed behind them, she stopped and pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed. "Just once. Those letters," she said. "They've been sitting in that folder for 12 years. "Yes," Marsh said. "He kept them because he knew." "People often know," Marsh said quietly. "They just need someone to make it worth knowing." She pushed off the wall. "Let's go." The session resumed at 9 sharp. Calloway admitted the Creighton documents into evidence over the objection of Whitaker's attorneys, who argued chain of custody and relevance with the specific desperation of men who know the argument won't hold but have to make it anyway. Calloway overruled both objections in under 4 minutes. Creighton took the stand. He was a precise witness, not dramatic. Not embellished, just accurate in the way of a man who has rehearsed the truth in his head for 12 years and knows every word of it. He identified each document. He explained the context of each one. He described, in specific detail, the meeting at which Andrews had been instructed to file a false assessment and the financial arrangement that had accompanied the instruction. When he named the principal partner who had given the instruction, the room went absolutely silent, because the name he gave was not Whitaker. The name he gave was Whitaker's father. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then it broke open. Amelia sat at the table and felt the shock of it move through the room, through the gallery, through the press of people standing at the back, through the 5 families in their seats, and she understood immediately what it meant and why it mattered. Whitaker hadn't started this fraud. He'd inherited it. He had grown up in a family that had been systematically stripping land from Virginia families for a generation before he was old enough to understand what was happening. And when he was old enough, he had simply continued it. Because it was the business he'd been raised to run, and no one had ever made him stop. She looked at him. For the first time since the hearing began, Whitaker's composure had actually cracked. Not collapsed, he was too controlled for that, but cracked. Something had come apart behind his eyes. Something that looked, under all the calculation and patience and comfortable authority, like a man who has just been confronted with a version of himself he had never expected to see in a public room. She felt something unexpected, not satisfaction, not triumph. Something more complicated and less clean than either of those. She was looking at a man who had done real harm to real families, deliberately and with full knowledge for years. She held on to that. But she was also looking at a man who was in this moment genuinely exposed, and exposure, she was learning, was different from justice. Justice was what she was here for. Exposure was just what came first. Whitaker's lead attorney rose. "Commissioner Judge Calloway, I'd like to request a brief recess." Calloway looked at him over his glasses. "Denied," he said. "Continue, Mr. Marsh." Marsh was on his feet within seconds. He moved through the remaining documentation with the focused efficiency of someone who has been building toward this moment for weeks and knows exactly how much time he has to use it. He entered the Creighton letters formally. He cross-referenced them against the Andrews survey, against the Meridian succession documents, against the loan note on the Carter Western parcel. He built the case the way Amelia had watched him build it from the beginning, stone by stone, in order, with the intention of holding up something that would last. When he was done, he said, "The pattern of fraud documented here spans more than 30 years and affects no fewer than 7 families in this county. It involves the deliberate suppression of land assessments, the manipulation of debt instruments, and the systematic targeting of families at moments of financial vulnerability. The Carter family situation is not an isolated case of bad debt. It is the most recent chapter of a deliberate and sustained criminal enterprise." He paused. "We ask the court to void the loan note as fraudulently obtained. Return clear title of the Western parcel to the Carter family, and refer the full matter to the appropriate authorities for criminal review." He sat down. The room breathed. Calloway looked at Whitaker's table. "Mr. Alderton, your response." Alderton stood. He was a skilled attorney, and Amelia watched him construct the best argument available with the materials he had left, which were considerably fewer than they'd been yesterday morning. He disputed the chain of custody on the Creighton documents. He argued that the sins of the father should not be assigned to the son. He suggested that Whitaker had been operating in good faith with a business he had inherited, with no direct knowledge of how its foundational contracts had been obtained. He made the argument as well as it could be made. It wasn't well enough. When he sat down, the silence in the room was the specific kind that comes before something final. Calloway looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He took his glasses off and set them on the bench and rubbed the bridge of his nose, which Amelia had come to understand over the last 2 days, was what he did when he was about to say something he had already decided and was making sure of the words. "I've reviewed the documentation presented in this hearing," he said. "I've reviewed it carefully, and I want to be precise about what I find." He looked at Whitaker's table. The loan note on the Carter Western parcel was obtained through a chain of entities with documented connections to fraudulently suppressed land assessments. The validity of that note is inseparable from the validity of the underlying collateral claim, which is in turn inseparable from the Andrews survey, which this court finds was falsified. He paused. "The note is void." Amelia's hand pressed flat on the table. "Furthermore," Calloway continued, "the court finds sufficient grounds to refer the full matter, including the Creighton documents, the Meridian succession records, and the testimony of the 7 affected families to the state attorney's office for criminal review." He looked at Whitaker directly. "Mr. Whitaker, I'd strongly advise you to retain separate criminal counsel. He put his glasses back on. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and the room came apart. She did not stand immediately. She sat at the table while the room moved around her voices. Movement, the gallery breaking into the specific noise of 40 people trying to talk at once, and she sat with her hands flat on the table and felt the verdict settle into her like water into dry ground. Void. The note was void, the parcel was theirs, the fraud was on record. The criminal referral was filed. 30 years of her family's history. Rewritten in a morning. Marsh's hand came down on her shoulder briefly. He said something she didn't fully hear. She nodded. Clara was suddenly beside her, and Clara's face was doing something extraordinary. Clara, who never cried, who maintained composure as a matter of personal principle, had tears running down her face that she wasn't bothering to wipe away. You did it, Clara said. Amelia said. Don't be modest, it's unbecoming. Amelia almost laughed. It came out shaky but real. She stood. She turned toward the gallery, and the 5 families were there, the Hendersons, the Prestons, the Garfields, and the others, and Mrs. Henderson was already moving toward her with that flat, certain walk, and when she reached Amelia, she took both her hands and held them, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for standing first." Amelia held her hands and felt the weight of that, the specific, irreducible weight of having done one right thing and having it matter to someone other than herself. You stood too, she said. That's what made it real. She looked up, past Mrs. Henderson, past Clara and Marsh, and the families in the crowd pressing toward the front. Across the emptying room she found Whitaker. He was standing with his attorneys. Speaking quietly, his face rearranged back into something controlled. He was already calculating. She could see it already working out the next position. The criminal defense, the shape of the fight to come. He was not a man who stopped. She had always known that. The criminal referral would lead to more proceedings. More attorneys, more months of careful legal work. This was not the end of everything, but it was the end of this. And this was what had mattered most. Whitaker turned and met her eyes across the room. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The verdict had said everything that needed saying, with the full authority of the circuit court behind it. In a room full of witnesses, he looked away first. She turned back to her people. Nathaniel was waiting outside. Not on the steps where he'd been the evening before, further back. Near the edge of the street, giving her room. He was watching the courthouse doors, and when she came through them, he straightened. And she saw something move through his face that was more honest than anything she'd seen from him in all the months she had known him. She went down the steps. She crossed to where he was standing. They looked at each other. "It's done," she said. "I heard," he said. The whole street heard. She almost smiled. He looked at her with the careful, direct attention he had withheld from her for so long and was still learning how to give. "How do you feel?" She thought about it. She thought about the night she'd walked out of Brooks' estate with her bare finger and her clean anger and no idea what she was walking into. She thought about the account books and the riding out before sunrise and Howell in his chair with his pipe and Mrs. Henderson's nod and Creighton's 12-year-old folder and Marsh's pen moving fast. She thought about her father's face when he'd said, "Your grandfather would have liked you." She thought about her mother, sitting in the chair by the window, without saying a word and saying everything. "I feel like myself," she said. "For the first time in a very long time. I feel exactly like myself." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "That's the best answer you could have given." "I know." He looked at her. The morning light was full now, and the street around them was alive, and she was standing in the middle of it. Not at the edge of it, not waiting to be pointed somewhere. Just standing in it as if it belonged to her, which it did. She was beginning to understand that. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I know that. You've already apologized. I know. I'm saying something different now." He met her eyes. I'm saying I understand now what I was looking at when I looked at you. And I understand that understanding it too late is its own kind of loss. And that I have no right to ask you to account for that." He paused. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the man who had called her suitable in front of 40 people. She thought about the man who had stood in her sitting room and said a failure of character. She thought about the documentation handed over with no conditions, and the courthouse steps the evening before, and "You were extraordinary in there," said quietly, not for anyone else, just because it was true. She thought about the kind of change that didn't announce itself. That just showed up, morning after morning, in the small choices a person made about who they were going to be. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. "Come to dinner next week," she said. Not an arrangement, not a transaction, just dinner. He was still for a moment. Something moved through his face, not the controlled, armored stillness she'd seen at Brooks Estate, but the other kind. The kind that comes when a door you'd stopped expecting to open does. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." She nodded. She turned to go back to where Marsh and Clara and the families were waiting. He said her name. She turned back. "Carter Valley," he said. "That's what people are starting to call it. What your family's land is being called." He held her gaze. "It's a good name." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said it always was. "We just needed to remind them." She went back to her people. 3 months later, the first coal contract was signed. Amelia sat at the writing desk, the one that wobbled on its left leg and smelled of cedar. The one her father had built for her mother 30 years ago, and she read every line of it before she signed it. She read the terms and the projections and the legal protections she had insisted on and received. And when she reached the end, she picked up her pen and signed her name with the same careful precision she brought to everything now. Her father was in the room. He sat in the chair by the window, the one that had been her mother's chair for 30 years. And he watched her sign, and he said nothing, which was how she knew it mattered to him more than he had words for. Thomas was in the doorway. He'd stopped knocking when she was at the desk. He just appeared when something was happening that he thought she ought to know about, or that he wanted to witness. She'd stopped asking him to explain it. Some things didn't need explaining. She set the pen down. The western parcel was theirs. The coal seam was documented and contracted with a company whose record she had checked 3 times and whose terms Marsh had reviewed twice. The criminal proceedings against Whitaker's estate were ongoing, would be ongoing for months, possibly years. But the families who had been harmed were named in the complaint. Their damages on record, their testimony preserved in the circuit court files where no one could bury it. Howell had attended the signing of the geological certification. He'd driven himself alone, and he'd sat in the back and watched, and when it was done he'd come to her and shaken her hand and said, "Your grandfather's land, properly valued at last," and gone home without staying for the meal she'd offered. She had let him go. Some things were complete on their own terms. Marsh had billed her a third of his standard rate for the case, which she'd disputed, and he'd told her that cases like this one were what he'd gone into law to take, and that she should put the difference toward the workers on the parcel. And she had. Clara had not said "I told you so," which was the most restrained thing Clara Monroe had ever done. And Amelia had told her so, and Clara had said, "I'm saving it. I'll use it later." "I know you will," Amelia had said. Nathaniel came to dinner the following Sunday. He came to the Carter house, not Brooks Estate, not the fine rooms and long tables of his world, but the house that wobbled and smelled of cedar and had been held together by her mother's quiet dignity for 30 years, and he sat at their table, and he talked with her father about the harvest and with her mother about nothing in particular, and with Thomas briefly about the horses, and he ate what was put in front of him without commenting on what it wasn't. And he was more present in that room than he had ever been in the rooms she'd known him in before. She watched him across the table and thought, this is who he is when he's not performing what he thinks he needs to be. This is the man underneath the monument. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that man. She was honest about that, with herself, that she was not ready to give him everything. That trust rebuilt itself slowly and on its own timeline. That the road from suitable to something real was long, and she had only just agreed to walk it. But she was walking it. That was the thing. She had agreed to walk it with her eyes open, which was the only way she agreed to anything now. After dinner, he helped Thomas with the horses, which surprised her. And then he came back in and sat across from her in the sitting room, and they talked, actually talked. The kind of talking she had wanted from him since before the engagement dinner. The kind that went somewhere for 2 hours. When he left, he paused at the door. "Same time next week," he said. "Same time next week," she said. He nodded. He put on his hat. He went out into the night. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride down the drive, and she thought about the woman who had set a ring on a table 6 months ago and walked the length of a dining room with 40 people watching her and not hurried once. She thought about what that woman had known in that moment that she hadn't had language for yet. She had known that suitable was the wrong word for her, that acceptable was the wrong measure, that the room she was in was the wrong room, and that somewhere beyond it was a life she'd have to build herself, with her own hands, from exactly the materials everyone else had decided were all she deserved. She had been right. The drive was empty now. The night was warm and full of the same sounds as always: the trees, the horses, the night birds calling their 2 notes over and over, patient as a heartbeat. She stood in the doorway and breathed it all in. Then she went back inside, sat down at her mother's writing desk, and opened the next file. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And Amelia Carter, who had walked away from a man who couldn't see her, built a case from nothing, protected her family's land, and brought 30 years of fraud into the light of a public courtroom, sat down to do it. Not because someone needed her to, because she had decided, on a night 6 months ago in a carriage rolling away from Brooks Estate, that she was done being what the world expected and ready, at last, to become what she had always been, and that was a woman no one, not Whitaker, not the men who'd signed false surveys, not the rooms that had looked through her, not even the man who'd called her suitable in front of 40 witnesses, would ever make the mistake of underestimating again.